This next panel is called The Future of Democracy. I don't know how you feel this morning, but I got a lot of questions. I got a lot of things to be talking about, and I really don't want to be on this stage talking, and not actually let it drill down to what does policy look like, what does change look like, and how can we make sure that things are kept accountable in order to make that change happen, right? Right? Okay, dokes. So without further ado, I'm going to make sure that all my bios are in place. I don't know if Mete is out here, but I will save. No, it's okay. Let him say it back to Tony Blair. It's okay. Okie dokes. The CEO of this place right here, and someone who is an absolute gem to hear from today. Can you give it up for Andrew, who's the CEO of Plexel, please? Give it up for Andrew, please. Very excited. Usually we see each other on Zoom, so to see each other in person is very exciting. Can you give it up for someone who is in the YouTube space? It's Alice Capel in the house. Let's go, Alice. Alice is out here, looking gorgeous in the turtleneck in purple. And if you see the shoes as well, it's really swaggy. Please, Anya James, all things education, is in the house as well. If we're going to be talking about politics, and we've got the Tony Blair Institute here with us today, we have got Ryan Wayne, who's the Executive Director of Politics. Hi, Ryan. Hello. And last, but certainly not least, we've got the Professor of Law at Howard University. Can you put some respect on his name? Give it up for Justin, please, coming through for this panel to talk to us about the future of democracy. Please come and take a seat. I'm very gassed to sit next to you, so there we go. And of course, the last chair, don't think Swaj, you can't count, is actually for the CEO of My Life, My Say. Is he going to come out and say, tonight, Matthew, I'm going to be... Do we have smokes? Do we have mirrors? Do we have Mete Coban in the house? Hello? No, okay, well, it's okay. When he comes up, just start cheering randomly. It's all right. We're gonna get into it. So, these are big titles, these are big names, but these are some very, very big special guests joining me on the stage this morning to talk about the future of democracy. And so, just so we're all on the same page, my first question has to be: what is democracy? But what is democracy in your line of work, in your world? And so, let me start over to my left, over to my right even. Andrew, in terms of Plexel, in terms of all that you do as the CEO here, what does democracy look like to you?
Yeah, thanks, Swazi. So I've got the pleasure not only of working in this amazing place and leading teams and the government to innovate, but I'm also the chairperson of My Life, My Say, so I get to see both sides of this debate. Now, for me, democracy is about allowing conversation and debate to prevail. So a system, a structure, a community that allows people's opinions to be aired, and it allows common sense and logic to be discussed. And as a result of that, we all get to input to it in different ways. And there is a system, there's a machine, there's tools that we need to use. And I think it's days like today where we need to understand what those tools are. Because if our voice isn't heard, then we are not part of the conversation. And then we can't expect the machine to work for us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Let me jump into the YouTube space with yourself, Alice. And even when Tony said, you know what, there are so many voices online, how do you make sure that you can hear those that are actually trying to say good things online as well? So in terms of the YouTube space and as a YouTuber, what does democracy look like to you?
I guess I could say exactly the same thing, actually, but what's great with social media, and in my case YouTube, is that we actually have built this platform. And when I say have built, it's like the platform was there already, but we have created it as users, internet users, as content creators. So what I like about the platform is that I'll provide some... Usually what I do with my content is that I ask questions more than provide answers. And then people will provide answers by themselves in the comment section or by reacting to the content, sharing it on other platforms. So really what I believe in, for me, democracy is more about encouraging people, especially young people, to develop a political consciousness, whatever that means for them. And we talked about curiosity, we talked about learning about new things, and I think that's really important in that context, because political consciousness is something that you can apply to anything. So it's really about going out in the world, experiencing the world, and having that consciousness that allows you to see things differently. So I guess social media and what I do on YouTube goes in that direction.
Thank you very much. And you make a good point about asking questions as well. Yeah. There will be a very short time of Q&A depending on how much time we have. If someone can give me a wave when it's coming up to 1:45, that would be really helpful. But if you do have questions, keep hold of them because we will have time for a quick Q&A at the end. Anya, let me talk to you about education. My gosh. And also, you're heading up lots of things of post-16 education across lots of East London boroughs as well. So what does democracy look like in your world? It's pretty big.
Yeah, right. So as an educational professional, I always look at kind of the root of a word. So if we look at the root of the word democracy, it comes from the Greek words demos and kratos. So demos meaning the people and kratos meaning power. So to me, it means the power of the people. So democracy should actually translate to the people's power, or the people's say, or the voice, or the demands of the people. And so for me, when we actually look at what power is, knowledge is power, education is power, and being able to have this power and this control over your life should really influence democracy. And the way in which we get this power is through education, training, employment, which makes the world of work so much more easier to navigate. You're able to have that control over your own life if you have education, if you have knowledge, and therefore if you have power. So that's what democracy means to me.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Anyone studying? Please raise your hand. Anyone study? Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. We found our people. It's all right. There's lots of questions in terms of education coming up. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Thank you very much for coming through. You're the Executive Director of Politics at the Tony Blair Institute. So that's a big title. What does that look like on a day-to-day? And this might be an obvious question, but what does democracy actually look like in your role as well?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me here. And this is part of my job, which I'm so pleased and proud of. And I love our partnership with Mete and My Life, My Say, because I think democracy, there's two parts to it for me. There's collective democracy, which is exactly what we're doing today. And there's some key tenets of that. We have rights in collective democracy. We have the right to vote and select our leaders and representatives. But we also have the right to have our voice heard and to share ideas. But I also think there's a responsibility there as well. I think we have a duty to turn up and offer our thoughts and perspectives. And one of the things I say to my team at the Institute all the time, they hate me for it, is to communicate even when it feels really weird. So my message to you guys today is when you go out for a coffee or you're lingering around the hallways and you see someone you don't know and it's really awkward and you're sort of just hovering next to one another, start a conversation, ask each other questions. That is democracy, the clash and collision and marketplace of ideas. But if we've got collective democracy there, we've also got what I would say in individual democracy, and this is the freedom of the self. And this is something that I think we've taken for granted, but honestly, I think is genuinely at risk, and I think we're in the fight of our lives on this one, because you all have the right to be the best version of yourselves. So that's a right, but again, there's a responsibility there, because your right to do that also needs to allow other people to flourish and be the best versions of themselves as well. And that requires an active government, but it also requires us to turn up and to respect one another. And if you look around the world and at different countries, including and especially those which aren't democracies, you can see with very recent examples how that can come under threat and go at risk very, very quickly.
Thank you very much. Let me jump over to yourself, Justin. I'm sitting next to the professor of law at Howard University. That is huge. Thank you very much for joining us. I guess questions around justice and law and being heard and being able to feel understood really captures your world as well. So starting with the question I'm asking everyone, what does democracy mean to you?
Well, for me, it's important to always remember that democracy is not a spectator sport. Oftentimes, people have elections at different intervals and expect folks to engage just during the time of the election. But I think we should be thinking about democracy as a seat at the table, having your voice heard, especially as someone who is representing the youth voice. Too often people say that we're going to have the youth do this, the youth do that, and the youth are not the ones actually determining what their participation is going to look like. So thinking about what type of activities you can do in between elections. Oftentimes, democracy looks like protests. Oftentimes, democracy looks like having discussions like this and finding ways to influence your elected officials. Oftentimes, democracy happens more so on the local level with local elections than it does on the national level. But sometimes democracy can be international. I just came from the United Nations last week, We have a forum for human rights for people of African descent, and we're going to bring in a youth voice to make sure that the youth is represented and their concerns are heard. So it's about being heard, and it's about being heard in between elections when your voice can really matter the most. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Coming back to that point very, very soon. Can you give it up for Mete, please? He was late to his own panel. Let's go. There we go. No, I'm joking. We love him. I want to jump off your point, actually, Justin, just to go into Mete, because when you come to My Life, My Say, and you see other young people who determine what the graphics look like, who the speakers are, what the venue's saying, like everything down to the smallest to the hugest decisions determined by young people, it is so empowering. And so if you're thinking of, where do I start? I'm not really too sure how to get into this, but actually, My Life, My Say is a great place to begin. Let me jump over to yourself, Mete. How do you keep the young people at the center of everything that happens here? And also then, what does democracy mean to you and will continue to mean to My Life, My Say?
Yeah, sorry for running late. I wanted to have a separate entrance onto the stage. No, look, I think, just to build off on some of the, points that Ryan and Justin made is, it comes from a personal place, and I think partly the establishing of why we set up My Life, My Say. So you take me, for example, like my parents came here from Northern Cyprus in 95. I'm raised on, one of London's, like poorest council estates in Hackney. I couldn't go to school in my borough. Growing up, I got into politics because my local youth club, that was my second home while mum and dad would be working late. I'd spend every single day there after school between 4 and 9 o'clock for about 6-7 years. One day it just shut down, and it was like no one had the power to save it, or no one had the connections or the resources to save it, and no one lifted a finger to save it. And so for me, and this is the reason why My Life, My Say is so important, and I'm sure we all have our individual stories, it's about how do we collectively fight for the rights and make sure that your voices are heard. So one of the things that we're most passionate at My Life, My Say, and me and Swazi work, she doesn't take as much credit as she should, is that it's all about trying to make sure, as you say, from that littlest detail to the sort of the biggest strategy, we always involve young people with views, and that's what's really important for us. And there's so many ways that you can get involved. I should plug, and if I don't plug, my team would be very angry with me, is we do have a new program, which there is going to be a stall outside, which is called The Squad. And essentially what we're going to be doing in the run-up to the next general election is essentially training young people from across the country, giving you all the skills you need around public speaking, community organising, fundraising, stakeholder management, everything that you need to, not necessarily for you to be attached just to My Life, My Say, but for you to help you in your own life, but really with a program to make sure that when we get to the next election and when we have National Vote Registration Day, we have young people ready across the country, ready to get young people registered to vote, and then really, as Justin said, really build on that and not just sort of focus on the elections, but think about how do you build coalitions around specific campaigns and all those sorts of things as well. So if you can do one thing today when you walk out, and there are different ways you can get involved in the squad, is please do sign up to the squad, and I've done my bit now.
Brilliant. Okay, we ain't got long yet. I got 2 things I just want to know from these guys. 1, how can we get young people involved in spaces that we often aren't in? And 2, what are them barriers? Why are we not there? Why are we not at the table, as you said, right? So those are my 2 points, and then we're doing Q&A. And my hope is that we can actually be accountable with some of the things that come out of this conversation to look back and say, yeah, we hit it on the head and we made change. All right? All good? All good. All right, let me start with the barriers then. And you make a good point about youth clubs and how those are just controlled by people who are not in positions to then open them. So let me come to yourself, Anya, first, because I know you work so much with young people and so much in education. What are some of the barriers that you see young people facing to get into these rooms, and especially along the lines of youth services or youth centres or within education? What are some of those barriers and how can we overcome them?
I think some of the major barriers are that for young people, what we're seeing, especially in London and across the UK, is that we're having a lot of competition in terms of education, which means that post-16 providers just want the top tier of students, which means that we're not offering a system which is inclusive for all. And what that actually translates to is around 11.5% of all young people, so aged 16 to 24, are classified as NEET, so not in education, employment or training, which is actually over 500,000 young people. And so for these young people who their life chances are actually being stifled from a very, very young age. They're not having those opportunities to get into employment or to gain, as I mentioned earlier, that power and that control over their lives. Also, other things that have happened in terms of funding. So if I think back to a time when I had the least control and the most barriers was when I was in school, and I was a young mum. So my daughter's now 21, who's over there. So I was a very young mum, but what I had which supported me to continue in education was EMA. So for me, that was a lifeline. That helped me to be able to continue. And through then achieving good GCSEs, really good A-levels, going on to do my degree, I was able to gain that power. But I had that financial support to be able to help me. And when we think about youth clubs, we have to think about seeing young people in a holistic view. So it's not just the school and the education, but youth clubs offer a vital lifeline for young people. And if young people don't have a place to go and speak to somebody or to find out about services that are in their area, they become lost. They become trapped in a system. They lose that sense of, sorry, my hair's in my face. They lose that sense of control and power and ownership over their lives. And therefore, life doesn't become about planning forwards. It becomes about living day to day. And that's probably one of the biggest barriers, living day to day rather than able to plan and see a future for yourself.
That's a brilliant answer. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing as well. It's always lovely to hear someone's background as to where, click your fingers, man. The boats are in the house. I'm just going to jump over to Alice because where young people definitely are is online. And their platforms speak volumes, right? And oftentimes within politics seem to be chasing after young people because that's where everyone is. So you got together loads of people who are critical thinkers. But what are still some of the barriers for young people, especially when so many of us are present online?
I think maybe the biggest criticism we have with everything that is connected to online activism, being political online, is that it can be a bit performative. So on platforms like Twitter, for example, people will shout at each other just for the fun of it, in a way. So maybe we lose this sense of how can I say that? The thing that, for example, you'll find in local, real-life groups where you're actually directly communicating with people. So there's that, but I think that it still remains important that we have those platforms, we have those things because they create connection between people who wouldn't have met each other outside of those platforms. And again, the political consciousness aspect of it, so it actually engages people who didn't think about those things in the first place. So what I found super interesting with social media, etc., is that you'll start with very basic topics that can be related to pop culture, things like that, and people will start to think critically about those things, engage more and more, and then develop some political consciousness, and then they want to take part in something bigger. So I really see it as some sort of a new foundation for people to get ideas, get engaged, but ultimately the goal is to, get engaged physically, possibly. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And just a quick question before I come to you, Justin. How do you sift out good news from fake news? As someone who is in the space, how do you determine which is which?
It's still with me? Yeah. Oh gosh, it's really hard, and something I feel the internet is still very new, especially what we do on social media, politically, etc. So we're still trying to figure out how to provide the best value possible, who we should listen to. Unfortunately, most of the time, platforms will favor content that is made by people who are already legitimized on other platforms or are already journalists, etc., which is kind of a shame because, ultimately, it kind of favors people who, are already established, so have already benefited from some more powerful structures. So I think it's important that we continue to work with platforms, etc., to show them that even people who aren't legitimized by the system, people whose voices aren't always heard, deserve to be heard, say very interesting things, because there are a bunch of creators online, people who say very interesting things, can share very interesting ideas, but their voices aren't heard enough, or they really have to fight to get heard, so yeah.
And your word performative there makes me jump and think about all the work that you do. And you're grinning already because you know it's Swaz. I know what question is coming. But people galvanized online and then galvanized in person to protest or to make their voices heard, which then actually causes the ears of the people at the top to come down and listen to them because they're like, wow, there's real interest here or there's a real concern. And so how do you make sure that democracy is not performative in the work that you do?
One thing that you can do is make sure that your voice is authentic. What I mean by that is to tell your story in a way that's very personal and true to yourself, and that also speaks to a larger issue. The story of yourself feeds into stories that affect all of us, the political stories, that can then bring some energy to your call for action. So for example, just last week I had 10 students from my university, Howard University, the greatest HBCU, historically black college in the world, thank you. They were talking about how issues affecting black people in their hometown needed to be addressed. And what they did is they went back and they studied the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN has put forward and tracked whether their communities were making progress on healthcare, on education, on all of these different metrics in relation to the black community. And then they presented that to the United Nations. So their story, their campaign, their political project came out of their own childhood experiences, the things happening in their hometowns involving their families. And so when their voice was heard, it came from an authentic place. And I think that's the important thing that leads people to feel inspired to want to go out and even take the risk of protests or finding other ways to really bring energy into the campaign because they know it's something that's true to you.
Yeah, absolutely. My next question, I wonder if I could join forces between Ryan and Mete, because in that last conversation, Mete, with Tony Blair, you mentioned how, voting isn't even online. You can't even... Fam, do you know how many things we can do online? Why can't I vote online? That's wild, Even to check if I'm registered to vote, that's very mad. So if people, and even when I vote, I don't understand why I'm voting in pencil. Is anyone on that wave? Like, how do I know that you lot aren't going to rub it out? But these are the questions that make me 1 degree but less in terms of my trust towards politics. So I'm just going to join forces. This is not in the paper, by the way. This question is just off the head. But what does the policy look like? Today we've said online voting isn't a thing. Why isn't it a thing? What happens with young people who aren't voting? The statistics say that half of 16 to 24-year-olds from the last didn't vote at all. I wonder if it was as quick as Deliveroo, as quick as Just Eat, it would be quick, right? You would be able to vote. So why isn't that a thing? And then talking to policymakers, talking to people who are in those spaces in terms of politics, how does that then become something that from today can make work and make happen? So before I come to you, Ryan, that's a big question. But Mete, why aren't young people voting? What was that research around? And why is it then that it's not even a possibility to do so online?
So I think very briefly and quickly, there's 3 things. The first thing, well, there's more than 3 things, but 3 broad things. The first is we're not educated about how democracy works in this country. So, you go to school, for example, you learn about things like periodic tables and stuff. Not saying it doesn't matter, right? But you're not really going to apply it in your day-to-day life. But no one ever teaches you in our schooling system, how do you negotiate a pay rise at work? How do you manage your taxes? Why do we have democracy? What is a democracy? How do you vote? Why do you vote? All of the basics that you need to be able to be an adult, and then it's almost like you go to school for 19 years, and then you realize that actually, you don't even know anything because you're having to relearn a whole new set of things that no one's ever taught you. And if you don't have the privileges of your family teaching you those things from younger, then it's almost, and then some people get really shy to ask those questions, right? Because you're 21 and you're asking, how do you vote or thing, and it feels a bit of a weird thing to ask. So I think there's the question of education, and we need to really think about political literacy in this country. The second thing is, let's face it, politicians don't help themselves. They do things that obviously put people off from engaging in politics. So whether it was in this country where we had, the tuition fees being trebled, even though it was promised that it was never going to be increased, it puts people off because people are just like, what's the point? Or like Boris Johnson's Partygate, telling everyone that you have to abide by COVID rules, and then meanwhile you're having parties in Downing Street. People then get put off politics. So those are sort of the broad things that put people off. And I think, what we need to do is really thinking about how do we practically make politics more available? So I think, the world of work has changed. You don't work from 9 to 5 no more. That's completely changed. Why not move the election to a weekend, for example, or make it over 2 days to give more people time to vote, or the fact that you have to go to a local polling station to vote, or the fact, because if it's like a cold evening like today after work, you're gonna not really be motivated to do that. Or make online voting. I mean, how many do you manage your finances online banking? Yeah, so if you can trust your finances online, why can't you trust your vote online? Basic things like that, or automatic voter registration. They're trialing this in the US actually, in Michigan, where they got automatic voter registration, which is amazing. So you're automatically registered to vote, you don't need to do nothing. And even if you're not registered to vote, if you go to the polling station on the day, if you're not on the register, you can register to vote on the day. It might take you a bit longer, but you can still register to vote so you don't miss it. Whereas in the UK, you can't do that. So we need to be a bit much more innovative, but ultimately it's gonna come down to, and this is where the politics gets involved, and I guess Ryan will talk about this now, the question is, do they really want young people to vote? There you go.
Them big questions they are. Okay. On that point, because say, for example, all of us got behind it and was like, we want to vote online, we want to vote online. Someone like yourself then, how does that translate from this event, from this room, where you've got real data from young people to your job now? What is that pipeline transition?
So we need to come up with the answer in simple terms. And you asked where that answer comes from. We've heard about Michigan, but actually, if you look at Estonia, if you live in Estonia, it's a digital state. You can vote online in Estonia now. Countries can do it safely and security. So when someone tells you that you can't do it for those reasons, there's an answer. I just want to say a couple of things. I think I'm getting your vibes here on education. And what Mette just said about political education, I think, is really, really important. And again, there's a common theme coming up here. We shy away from doing that in schools because we hear all the bad things about it, that teachers will be indoctrinating kids. But actually, there needs to be better political education. And also, there needs to be better financial education as well. And I speak from experience as someone who found out the hard way what a credit score means when I sat face to face with a bailiff at the age of 20 in my shared student accommodation. And I'd let him in, which apparently is something that you just definitely don't do. And he was eyeing up the television. And I look back at 7 years of failed education up in Liverpool and not knowing what it meant to navigate debt. So education's really important. But let's swing back to this question of how we go from this room in order to properly affect and change. We've talked a lot today about speaking to power. And my message to you guys would be to aspire to become the power. And when we talk about voting in this country, the conversation is at political level isn't actually about online voter registration or voting online. It's about ID at polling stations and introducing ID to reduce voter fraud. Voter fraud in this country is like less than 0.000%. It's not actually a real political problem, but introducing voter ID disproportionately affects people of colour and disproportionately affects young people, particularly those in deprived backgrounds. And those guys probably aren't going to be voting for the government of the day. So that tells you everything you need to know. So you need to, of course, protest, but you also need to become the power as well. And we've heard about the importance of your story. And I'm going through this process at the moment, trying to work out what in my background makes my story. And I think about my mum and dad got divorced when I was about 13. And I look back at my upbringing, which wasn't political at all. My dad worked in a car factory up in Liverpool, and he worked really, really hard because my mum had posh aspirations. She liked shopping at Marks and Spencer's, but also, more fundamentally than that, she wanted us to have a good education, live in so go to a good area where there was good local state schools. So my dad working hard in Fords, but also a taxi driver of an evening, and my mum with aspiration. And the reason why I say that isn't so I can share my story with you, but you don't stop at your story. You don't stop at your story if you want to be the power, because what you've got to do is extrapolate from that broad brush principles and start to form your politics. So my politics is a combination of making hard work pay and aspiration and merging those two things together, and that creates stronger, securer families, which in turn create stronger, securer communities. Give yourselves permission to think like that. Coming back to the policy debate, So we got to this by talking about voting online and what that looks like from a policy perspective. But we're also going to hear a lot today about climate. I was just looking at the numbers before. 23 million homes in this country need to be insulated by 2030. 23 million. Do you think this government is able to deliver that? Probably not. But you know what? There is intellect, ambition, and enthusiasm in this room alone, that I know could deliver that through an innovative solution. So think about the problems at hand if you want to become the power, and think about the solutions for that as well. And the same on electric vehicles. I was looking before, there's 44,000 electric vehicle charging points in the UK. By 2030, we need 2.3 million. Do you trust this government and our politics as is to deliver them? Probably not. So think about your principles as well as your story, but also think about the challenges today, the actual exam questions on the table, and start coming up with the answers. And I promise you, this room will change from talking about speaking to power to being the room where power is held.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, Ryan. I think there's a panel later on coming on Make It Make Sense, and as valid as all of those points are, sometimes what I get lost in the conversation is that we start talking about one thing and we soon talk about so much more. You know, we asked about how do you take positions of we want this to be changed, and I'm asking, how do you make that happen? As a policy, as someone, it's good for Ted to tell us we're in power, but you're in power. So I'm asking, how do you make that transition between something we're saying, online voting, we want that to happen. How do you put those building blocks in place?
Well, I actually think we're in much of a similar position than you may think. I'm not in power. I'm in an organisation that's trying to influence power. But of course, our chairman is Tony Blair. You heard from before. Tony's a very influential person, so there's soft power that comes with that. But actually, the magic that's going to happen between our organisations and what today's about is us sitting down and coming up with solutions. So we should look at Estonia, we should look at the Estonian voting system, and then we put together that proposal. And politics at its best is really fucking boring, because we put together the ideas and the answers, and then we go and take that and we socialise it and share it. And it's not just about campaigning and protesting, getting angry. They are massively important because we've got to raise these issues. But what I'm saying is, if you want to see that change, you've got to bring solutions to government. And when you scratch beneath the surface of government, when you meet these guys up close, you're cleverer than them. This is the crazy thing. Like, it's so intimidating, and I felt this. Like, I met Tony by chance, and then 10 years later, I ended up getting a job with him. But I was terrified when I met him. I thought, this guy must know absolutely everything. But just last week, we were having a conversation about this event, and Tony's, what do we need to and we had such a positive, constructive conversation. And I wasn't bringing great intellect to the table, but again, it was that collision of ideas, and that's what we need to do, and get the answers and take the answers to power. But I do think it's really important to think about becoming the power as well. I think that's massively important.
And that's where I really commend you on that, because that honesty changes everything in this room. To come and say, actually, these are the things we know more as much as those at the top, that is really empowering. So thank you very, very much for that answer. I'm on time, but Andrew, let me come to you and say thank you so much for, one, just letting us be here, because this is your hometown, this is actually Blexel, but also you demonstrate so much examples of where you've listened to young people. So could you give an example that would obviously be really inspirational to us, but also really educational to others around in your field, to say, this is how Andrew does it, this is what works, and this is how we can then replicate it to make sure young people are part of our conversation as well?
Yeah, and following on from Ryan as well, I think it's easy to get depressed and think that democracy doesn't work for us all. I heard a stat recently that there's more prime ministers that have come from Eton School than there have been Labour prime ministers. And you just think, crikey, is this system actually accessible? Is it going to work for us? But then I think about the hope that rooms like this can have. And my business, the innovation business, is all about driving coalitions, driving collaborations. I think my call today is about the social coalitions. So what are the missions that are really important to us? Who's got the ideas? Who's got the engine room? who knows the destination, how we're going to get there, and how can we put ourselves to work together, irrespective of the logo that might appear on your pay slip or the skills that you might have. It's all about bringing everyone together in one place. And I'll just take Ryan's example there about 23 million homes in the UK need to be insulated. It's like, right, okay, so what can we do with that? Well, we need a workforce that's skilled. We need to get them on the road. It's like, okay, well, the Royal Mail seems to be in a bit of trouble at the moment. How about we reskill every post person in the UK to be able to insulate homes? And how about we think about what else they do when they're in the house? Because it's pretty much the first time, we're going to have a nationwide campaign to get into everyone's home. So what can we do in terms of social care? Do we need to put sensors in there to help isolated or elderly people? So actually, let's get the Royal Mail workers skilled up on that type of thing and let's make it happen. I'm pretty certain that if you can get the right people in a room, just with one idea like that, you can make it happen. But we've got to get them in the room, and there's a logo there saying the future starts today. Like, don't let this be just a conversation today. Form those coalitions today and get on with it.
Brilliant answer. Thank you very, very much. We've probably got time for we've got 5 minutes or so I can take 2 really quick questions. And I do believe there is a roving mic. Yes, we do have a roving mic. So I'm going to your hand, and then there was a hand on that side as well. So sorry to get your steps in, but please give us your name, and if you keep your question to 1 sentence or so, that'd be great.
Hi everyone, I'm Rosie. I'm 18 and the youth mayor of Islington, and I come from a black and minority ethnic background and a Turkish immigrant family. My parents came here in '92. You usually don't find young people like me in politics. You never do. So I was going to ask, how can we get more young people involved in local politics and then progress to national politics? Because I don't believe that national politics will work if local doesn't. How do we get more Turkish young girls? How do we get more African or black young girls to know that politics does exist for them and they can find a seat at places like this?
Brilliant. I'm actually going to hold that question and take the second one as well, and then we can answer as a panel. Yes. And your name, sir?
Yeah. Hello, I'm William. I'm 22. I've graduated from the USC in the summer, and I living in Hudson and in Cambridgeshire. I just want to ask to say that ultimately we've got an era where the costs are going up. We've got war in Ukraine potentially. There might be fear that might expand. Obviously, westwards potentially, depending on how the impact of that. And obviously, our cost is going up for young people, and particularly, how do we deal with the cost that we're discussing, we're facing? Has that been a barrier to potential people want to go into politics because they feel that ultimately we're just going to be being the cost of it rather than actually getting any benefits out of it?
William, you're my guy, This cost of living crisis, we're going to be getting into this. Let me take Rosie. It's Rosie, right? Yes. Let me come to Rosie's question first and give that to Mette. Because you do lots of things with young people and making sure that young people are involved at a local level, and then coming to yourself, Ryan, on the cost of living and how that can also be opened up for people who want to get involved in politics. But if anyone in between would love to chip in, please do. But Mette, let me start with you.
Yeah, great question, Roseanne. I'm also of Turkish Cypriot heritage, so it's great to see young people like you as young mayor of Islington. So give a massive round of applause as well. I think local government is so important, and I think there's often this myth that if you want to be in politics and make change, you should be an MP or you should be in Parliament. My mayor, who was here, who I think is gone now, right? He manages a budget of over £1 billion in Hackney, and that's from everything. And like myself, right, I'm a cabinet member in Hackney for the environment and transport. So I manage a budget of over £200 million in Hackney. Everything from, how you move around the borough in terms of your buses, walking, cycling, the public realm, the footways, making sure your bins are collected, making sure the streets are clean, our response to climate change, street trees, parks and green space, all these sorts of things. And I think it's so underrated in the sense that most of the things that you see around you that change is because of what you can do in local government. National government is also important as well, and what you can do in Parliament, but depending on what position you have, for example, if you're a backbench MP, you're less likely to have as much as influence as, say, someone like me in local government if you're a cabinet member. So I think what I would say is, and it goes back to what Tony was saying, before you answer where you want to get to in politics, or whether you want to go into politics, is what is it that drives you? what do you want to achieve? Like, why are you going into politics? When people always ask me, like, I got elected when I was 21, and people always say to me, you know, how do I get involved in politics, and, you know, how do I get elected? And it's like, but the question is, why do you want to get involved in politics? Once you discover why you want to get involved in politics, the position that you end up in is just a vehicle for change. So for example, for me, I'm not driven by wanting to be an MP or a minister or a cabinet member or a councillor or anything like that. For me, I'm interested, for example, I knew the 3 issues that really mattered to me when I was coming into politics. One was around climate and the planet, 2 was around social inequality, and 3 was around giving people a voice. And so for me, it's I will chase any position that enables me to be able to make a difference in all of those areas. So if it's being a councillor, great. If I feel like I want to scale it and do it at a bigger scale, then I'll look at that as well. So I think what's really important is really discovering why is it that you want to get involved in politics. But ultimately, what I would say to a lot of young people here is, it's much more easier to get into local government and into council positions, and really do take it up, because honestly, like, most of the difference that you can make in society is through local government, and it's such a rewarding job. And it's so amazing when you just, you know, have the opportunity where you're sitting with a family who's been living with like mold housing for like ages, and then you've managed to sort that out for them. It might seem like such a small thing, but when you see them smile in front of you, and you know, like, you've got their kids hugging you, like very happy and stuff, those are memories like that will never ever escape from you. So definitely do consider going into local government.